2019's Crawl is a movie that takes everyone's worst fear of living in Florida and makes it into a reality. And it's funny because I've lived in Florida pretty much my entire life, almost my whole life. And people who don't live in Florida always bring up, oh, well, I don't know about Florida because there's alligators and there's hurricanes. Well, this movie takes that fear and triples it and quadruples it and makes it into an actual tangible, realistic, terror. Now, the movie is produced by Sam Raimi, directed by Alexandre Aja, and it stars Kaya Scodelario, I can never pronounce that name, as Haley Keller, who's basically this competitive swimmer. And the whole story behind the film is that she's this competitive swimmer and her dad was her big inspiration. She decides to go and look after her dad because there's a Category 5 hurricane that's about to hit the Pasco County area of Florida, which is actually, I can drive there from where I'm at. Pasco County is not that far from me. And it's not as bad as it's played up in the movie, obviously. In real life, this type of stuff rarely ever happens. Obviously, if you live in certain parts of Florida, you are more vulnerable to hurricanes, and other parts you're more vulnerable to crocodiles and alligators and whatnot, and reptiles. But it's really obviously played up for the movie and made a much, much bigger deal. So she plays this swimmer. She wants to go home and take care of her dad because she's worried about his safety. And when she gets there, it turns out that, well, things don't go the way that she wanted. And of course, if you've seen the trailer, you know that she has to deal with gators. And that is the whole problem with the movie is that they're trapped in this house and they have to figure out a way to survive as long as possible until either rescue comes or leave the house. So it's one of those kind of movies where when you watch it, it's a bit more unsettling than a supernatural horror in some ways, because even though supernatural horror can really spook you, this is something that is, in a way, realistic. It's not something that I think is really tangible, because in real life, alligators really are not, this aggressive. And in this movie, there's some really violent, gory stuff in this film. You could kind of call it a modern take on Lake Placid, but it's a much better movie than Lake Placid. And it's sort of like, borrowing a lot of ideas from Jaws. It's the same kind of thing where you have this fear of the water, except this time it's not the beach, and it's not people casually going to the beach just to have fun. The storm comes to you, the beach comes to you, and flooding is another big thing addressed in this film that people worry about Florida. It's really not that bad at all, but when you watch the movie and you put yourself in the characters' situations, it can be a pretty dreadful thing. And in some ways, you're kind of wondering, what's a scarier thing, the alligators or the water level that continues to rise as you are trapped in a certain part of the home? Drowning is just as scary as anything else. And there's a couple of really, terrifying things that happen in the movie that if it happened to you, you'd freak. We would freak out. So, that's something to think about. But I think the movie's well acted. I think it was actually very, very well acted. It's really mostly just two human characters, a few other side characters, but mostly just two humans, the girl and her dad, and they're trying to figure out how to get out of here. And in a way, it's kind of like a puzzle. What I liked about the movie is that it did the jump scare sort of differently, in that it kind of reminded me of like the old Resident Evil games, like that scene where the liquor appears and there's actually a giant gator in Resident Evil 2. The way that the gators were introduced here is kind of like that, where it just kind of pops up and you're like, whoa, like it's done in a jump scare fashion, but I think it's done in a really, really good way. And of course, the big mystery of, you can't really see underwater, you don't know what's there. It does a good job of keeping you very much in suspense, and it does a good job of entertaining you the whole way through. I like this movie because it did not bore me. I was definitely hooked on the story and these characters trying to get out of this house, trying to get out of the situation for the entire film. And I think it worked. I think it really, really worked for me, and I enjoyed this movie. This is one that, it's a great date movie, so if you have a date, go and see this movie. It's a pretty decent, like I said, not really a supernatural horror film, not anything with killer dolls or anything. It's just something that could happen, but it's not a disaster movie. I wouldn't classify it as that. It's not one of those Independence Day type films. It's a small story of a family dealing with, the consequences of a gigantic hurricane and what it can do to a very small town. But once again, it's obviously played up it's obviously multiplied the danger level, because in real life these things just don't happen that frequently. I'm not gonna say they've never happened, but things similar to this have happened, but not quite like this. But either way, it's still a scary thing to think about, and Alexandre Aja really does play with you in the film. You know, it's a fun ride. You know, the movie keeps you in suspense. The movie keeps throwing obstacles at the characters, and you have to figure out how to get around it, and it all made sense, and it's a fun little ride, like I said. So if you want to go see Crawl, it's a thumbs up from me.